Welcome, everyone. We are really excited by the tremendous interest in the webinar and happy for you to join us today in celebrating neurodiversity on World Autism Awareness Day. We're really grateful you're here. It is an estimated about 20% of the global population exhibits some form of neurodivergence. And important to the many of us neurodiverse employees and employees who are caregivers to neurodivergent loved ones to raise awareness. And that's why we're here today, to talk about strategies for retaining and supporting employees in the workplace who might be neurodivergent or caring for neurodivergent loved ones. We hope that you'll walk away today with three things: better awareness regarding neurodiversity in the workplace, best practice around embracing diversity and creating a culture of care, and some actionable steps that you can take to support neurodivergent employees and employees who are caring for neurodivergent loved ones. Just a couple housekeeping things. About midway through the discussion, you'll have two polling questions for the audience. And when you see the poll appear, you'll be able to select your response by clicking it right on your screen. And then the results will be totaled and shared with all participants. And then throughout the discussion, please submit your own questions through the Q&A feature. The questions will be anonymous to the audience. And then we'll plan to leave about 10 minutes at the end of the session to answer a couple questions. If your question isn't answered during the session, one of our speakers will follow up with you afterwards. So let's dive in. I am Elena Molina, Chief Strategy Officer at Family First. We're a solution that's focused on uncovering and solving the impossible for caregivers around the world. And then prior to joining Family First, I spent 20 years in employer health and welfare consulting. And then joining me are three incredible people and insightful leaders that I admire very much for their knowledge and passion. I have Rebecca Warnken, Senior Vice President at Aon, Connie Rust, Director of Client Success at Joshin, and Sara MacDonald, Chief Operating Officer at Family First. Well, thank you all for joining me. Rebecca, if you could kick us off and share your career journey in connection to neurodiversity.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Elena. I'm glad to be here. My name is Rebecca Warnken. I am part of Aon's Health Solutions practice. I use she, her pronouns, and I am neurodivergent. More on that in just a minute. I've been in the health employee benefits consulting space for about 20 years in lots of different roles. I'm an actuary by background, but currently I'm just so excited to be working with clients across the US and in North America to really drive and develop better inclusive and equitable benefits. And that's for all populations, but neurodiversity being an area that's of particular passion for me. That's my professional life. On a personal level, I'm a mom with two kids. My oldest son is 10 now. He was diagnosed on the spectrum at age 2. And that was really my first foray into this world of autism and neurodiversity. He was diagnosed and we knew almost nothing about autism and got my arms around everything I possibly could. There's absolutely no roadmap out there. If anyone out there as a parent, you're kind of just thrown into it. But, it became apparent pretty quickly to my husband and I that our son didn't necessarily fit the box that we were given by a medical diagnosis, as well as sort of the local school system. So it's really been a journey in getting to know him and all of his needs, but also all of his amazing strengths. And then, as I alluded to, part 2 of my story is sort of my own journey in sort of reading and learning about women and girls on the spectrum. I saw a lot of myself in that. It was kind of this aha moment of like, oh, like, am I neurodivergent? And that, so equally as we've been navigating everything for my son, it's also been sort of a personal journey and sort of understanding myself better. And, understanding I don't also fit necessarily in a nice, neat box. I identify more as autistic than ADHD, but I see some ADHD traits in myself. So, it's really, I think, driven both my, advocacy outside of work, but also the work I do with clients and really making sure we're thinking about neurodiversity as part of our broader DEIB initiative. So really glad to be here and part of the conversation today.
Thanks so much for sharing, Rebecca. And I love your passion for neurodiversity awareness and for building solutions for more inclusive workplaces. Thank you. And Connie, would you share your career journey in connection to neurodiversity?
For sure. Yeah, thanks for having me. So for me, I got into this work. For context, I had a sister named Alex who passed away about 11 years ago with cerebral palsy and other disabilities. And at the time, really thought that was the extent of what disability looked like, was like for folks to experience. And but around that time, I had been dealing with my own epilepsy diagnosis for nearly 5 years and kind of that non-visible condition. And but similarly, that is also a neurodivergent condition as well. So really, I'll dive into more of what that means, but also included in that umbrella. And as I got into, I was far enough in my college career when she passed where I pursued a full-time job, was kind of raised in this family of you can always volunteer with the communities you're passionate about, but you don't need to really bring that into your full-time job. And quickly felt this balance, or it was not sustainable for me to do that anymore. And I pivoted and got my master's in business and master's in social work, originally intending to start a nonprofit in this field of disability and neurodivergent support, and worked in nonprofit residential settings, specialized schools, and post-grad planning and vocational rehabilitation support, and healthcare as well. All of these are pivotal and really important spaces, but felt this continual gap of needing to scale support. And that's where I found Joshin, a tech-based support system where supporting parents, supporting employees who eventually kiddos who get diagnosed do get older, who need support, and adults also need support where there is oftentimes lacking those spaces to figure out that self-discovery piece. So that is where I get to be here now and supporting in a client success capacity. So really bringing support to our different partnerships to date.
All right, thanks for sharing your story, Connie, and for all the work that you do that empowers the neurodivergent community. And Sara, would you share your career journey and connection to neurodiversity?
Thank you, Elena. Thank you for having me here today. I'm so excited to be here, especially on World Autism Awareness Day, and talking about their themes for acceptance, support, and inclusion. I'm Sara MacDonald. I currently lead the operations for Family First, which is an end-to-end full comprehensive platform that uncovers and solves all the aspects that caregiving employees face and creates long-lasting outcomes for themselves, their families, and their employment. As a nurse by background, my life has been dedicated to helping others. I have a passion for advocating for people, creating experiences and moments where they feel heard, included, and supported. In the past 15 or so years, I don't want to age myself too much, I've had the opportunity to help influence and create more of those moments for patients, families, and caregivers through my roles in clinical and operational leadership. Prior to coming to Family First, I led the operations team for an organization called Best Doctors, who advocated for medical second opinions, which is now known as Teladoc. Most importantly, and my direct connection to neurodiversity, is that I am a mom and a caregiver, and a huge reason I am very passionate about the topic today. My 19-year-old son has coexisting autism and ADHD, and we have been on a lifelong journey. It has been an exciting journey. It has been a challenging journey. It has been a fun journey. It has been a journey, like Rebecca said, around discovery of who he is, discovery of who we are as parents and supports and caregivers. We have faced ambiguity with diagnoses at some point, delays in important treatment modalities, and really lends to my passion to advocate through and through for people and caregivers who are taking care of loved ones with neurodiversity. Excited to share, today is a big moment. As we were prepping for this, he just texted me that he got his permit at 19 years old. And so when we approach this conversation and celebrate, there are lots of milestones and amazing things that happen on the journey of neurodiversity, and excited that we get to bring awareness and the conversation to so many people in the world.
Thanks for sharing your story, Sara. And I get to see every day, and I really appreciate how your experience drives your compassion and your determination to build solutions for and advocate for caregivers across a whole spectrum of needs. All right, so we've mentioned ADHD and autism, and I think it would be helpful context to share how we define neurodiversity and what it means to be neurodiverse. Rebecca, would you share what we mean when we talk about neurodiversity?
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually, just an anecdote, someone misheard me once and thought I said neurodiversity, like nerd diversity,
Oh.
which I kind of loved.
Yeah.
Like not at all what I was saying, but anyway, you know, I think it's important to take a really broad perspective on neurodiversity, and it's really just the natural variation in our brain wiring. So we all have different ways of thinking, communicating, socializing, and you know, if you kind of think of a bell curve, there's people that fall more in the middle of typical cognitive functioning, and that's neurotypical, sort of the dominant neurotype. But then there's lots of people that are on various parts of the fringes, and you might hear the term spiky profile. So a lot of neurodivergent people may have some cognitive abilities that are enhanced or amplified, and then others that are weaker or not as strong. And so I think it's, you know, everybody's different, and there's so much diversity within neurodivergent populations. But I think some common things we see are, you know, executive functioning challenges like working memory challenges, or sensory differences that might be, again, sort of on like the outside of the bell curve. We all experience sensory processing, but it's sort of on the more extreme ends. And by taking that broader perspective, we're talking about things like autism and ADHD, but also, you know, that we know from, you know, research that the brain can be rewired due to trauma or illness or injury. So think of like complex PTSD, you know, people who have brain fog due to long COVID. So it's a really big umbrella of people that you know, are considered neurodivergent, and could be people with a medical diagnosis or not. So I think we're taking a really broad perspective on it, on the term.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Sara or Connie, anything you add?
Yeah, I'll just add real quick, from the National Institute of Health, the prevalence is about 15 to 20% of people. So about 1 in 5 folks are potentially neurodivergent, likely underreported. Just self-disclosure around this is becoming more normalized. We'll talk more about that. And I think too, some people might not quite identify with being neurodivergent, who might be have some of the conditions that might from the neurodivergent community be identified as such. So thinking like bipolar disorder, epilepsy, as I mentioned, sensory processing, obsessive compulsive disorder. So really just taking that person's truth, and heard a quote recently, if you've met a person with autism, you've met a person with autism, meaning just it's an individualized perspective in relationship to the world. But that being said, there are oftentimes traits that the sensory pieces that Rebecca alluded to that fall into this umbrella.
Yeah, really good points. Go ahead, Sara.
And when I think about, you know, you have these big topics or clinical terms, and what I ask everyone to do is just really look at what it is, neurodiversity, and the breakdown of it is the diversity of the human mind. And there is such beauty in that. And as we dive into our conversation, I think the beauty of that and what we can celebrate is really going to come out. But you know, that nurse in me goes, okay, if you're not sure, let's just look at those terms, neurodiversity, and it's just that complete diversity of the human mind, which is really neat and intriguing and exciting.
Yeah, great points. And we're coming together on World Autism Awareness Day, not only because we want to bring awareness, but to your point, because we want to celebrate neurodiversity. People often focus on the challenges of being neurodivergent, and we all really want to change that narrative and amplify the strengths and the talents of neurodivergent individuals. So Rebecca, what would you say celebrating neurodiversity means to you and the organizations that you work with?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the thing is, even though the term is newer, neurodivergence is not new. There's tons of evidence that many disruptors and innovators in history have had neurodivergent brains. Unfortunately, though, just in modern times, we've been just so focused on the deficits and labeling as disorders, because that's what a neurotypical, sort of that dominant neurotype, has been able to see. And I just love absolutely the change. I mean, my son was diagnosed 8 years ago, even the change in just an 8-year period, where we're now recognizing not just the struggles and the deficits, but the amazing strengths and the amazing skills that neurodivergent people bring and we need, right? It's not just a nice thing to do to have diversity of thinking in our companies. It's a must if we want to continue to innovate and drive forward progress. So I think there's the celebration aspect is really recognizing and not only appreciating, but supporting and respecting different ways of thinking that might be different from my own. And then at an individual level, creating the spaces so that people can be their authentic selves at work and not feeling like they have to hide or mask their neurodivergent traits because they're afraid of stigma or stereotyping. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I think the celebration aspect is just, it's newer. And I think it's amazing that we're kind of moving past just being aware of our cognitive differences and really like celebrating and recognizing the strengths that it brings to a company and to society as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, and helps build more inclusive workplaces for sure. Sara, you have experience as a parent and work with a lot of individuals who are caregivers to neurodivergent children. From that perspective, what does celebrating neurodiversity mean to you, and how is it meaningful to the individuals and families that you work with?
What an awesome question. And I think we could spend the whole time talking about how do we celebrate this topic. And, you know, it really fits into diversity in its nature, right? Celebrating the differences that we all bring to the table. But when I thought about celebrating neurodiversity, my mind immediately went to the question of why are people great, right? And people are great because we are diverse. And we have different ways of approaching problems, different perspectives, alternative viewpoints within the world. And neurodiversity is just that. It's a different way of thinking, approaching, and problem solving. And so people who are neurodivergent, they have exceptional skills too. And those are the things that we really want to celebrate and focus on. And when we do that, not even just with neurodivergent people, with people in general, when you focus on their strengths, we're doing a lot of things for them. And as employers and leaders, we can do a lot for them that also benefits the entire environment around them. And so when we're able to focus on the strengths that neurodivergent employees and people and friends and family bring to the table, we're fostering self-esteem, which really creates better attitudes, positive mental health, or elevating mental health if there is a challenge there. We are motivating them, which in turn can create productivity in our work environments. It can create employee engagement. It can create better relationships. And 3, it allows people to grow faster. When they start to feel that confidence and they're achieving things in their roles or in their life, they learn new skills faster. And that's really supported by research as well. So for me, celebrating neurodiversity is really about that awareness. And like Rebecca said, the acceptance and focusing on the strengths and not looking at those opportunities. We never really win when you focus on all the opportunities, and we expel a lot of energy that could be put towards the positives around us.
You're right. Yeah, you're right. And changes and acceptance and culture really supports everybody when you make those changes. And Connie, you work with neurodiverse adults and supporting them and being their best selves at work. What does celebrating neurodiversity mean to you and the individuals and organizations that you work with?
Yeah, I think there's, and even for the audience here today, like there might be various states that you might be in. So given that this is our wheelhouse, maybe all day, every day, I will try to make it more applicable to everyone. But celebrating is reflecting, where is your organization currently at as far as acknowledgement or recognition of this community today, potentially, and also recognizing, is there someone in my workplace, gratitude for that skill set difference or complementary working environment of that person or persons. It's also not tokenizing or checking a box. So because you have one person on a team or in your workplace, a story of one person doesn't mean that the story is done there. It means being inclusive of all people and being diverse more broadly, to Sarah's point. It's about elevating perspectives and multi-generational perspectives. So ensuring that you're having conversations with kiddos, with adults in the workplace alike. The more we shy away from these topics with kids, the more taboo these topics become, the less normalized they become, and then the more ostracized these communities become. So just as a cyclical effect, if we don't acknowledge and teach kiddos about neurodivergence and their environments that they're in, and then really adjusting from there. So if there are gaps of where you are today, what are steps you can take to continually support the community? So a number of things to celebrate, recognizing that not every environment can do all of the things, but a lot of steps that we're honored to get to provide insight into.
Yeah, I love that. And a lot of times kids in the younger generation can also help drive the change and set the environment, that be the example for everyone. So celebrating neurodiversity also means challenging stereotypes and misconceptions about neurodivergence and neurodivergent individuals. Connie, what are some common stereotypes or misconceptions that you would like to bust?
So you might hear me go on a soapbox.
Please.
So I apologize in advance, but first of all, I love talking about the stereotypes because there are a lot of them. And then also, if you have questions around stereotypes that you're experiencing or observing, feel free to ask them in the anonymous Q&A. But
Yeah.
as far as our own company, so Joshin is co-founded by two twins with ADHD and two very different types of ADHD at that. And so I think something we're proud of is oftentimes ADHD is stereotyped as a highly distracted diagnosis that maybe can't achieve or overachieve and do these accomplished things. And so from that perspective, I'm really proud that a product or an organization has been built to represent the community by folks who are part of it. That's one piece. And then I think too, just autism primarily being a tech-focused or non-social diagnosis. So candidly, my husband has autism and is in a very highly social and relational job. And I think point blank, we're doing our companies and the communities a disservice if we're really assuming that folks are meant to be in these different boxes or certain industries. Off the cuff for just a moment, I was at a dinner last week and an inclusion diversity awards dinner, and the company who was recognized for gender equality was one that included women at a higher rate in heavy machinery roles in their company, and highly male. It's, assumed that more males would dominate these types of roles. But I think if we start to think about not where disabilities can fit into certain roles, but where can they fit into all roles, and same with neurodivergence, that's where really combating stereotypes, there's such an opportunity for that to happen. And I think too, I'll just end with this one, my own epilepsy. I'm particularly passionate about the ways in which epilepsy is not so greatly portrayed in films, particularly horror films. So oftentimes disclosing epilepsy, there's a sense of fear, and the reason for that is oftentimes the portrayal of how epilepsy is in film. And so all that to say, some tactical actions around how you can celebrate neurodiversity is something like a seizure first aid class, where it's not leaning away from a condition like epilepsy, but it's really leaning into how can I best support that community in a time of stress. So it is cool. I've gotten to kind of, since getting more passionate about this line of work, have gotten to meet some folks in the film who are trying to change that narrative around epilepsy specifically. That's my long answer.
I like that, and I appreciate that too. And in times where I've had colleagues or others share with me their neurodivergence. It's helped me to, even in preparing for the session today, like there's some comfort in the organization that's around things, so people know what to expect and can plan for things. And I appreciate very much that it makes it a more collaborative environment when people feel safe enough to share, and it helps me be more supportive and help others as well. Sara, Rebecca, would you add anything?
Yeah, I think, what Connie is talking about is so true. And I think about the work we do at Family First with caregivers in particular. And when we think about stereotypes and stigma and the feeling component that comes along with it, as Connie was talking, I was just thinking it's almost like a double whammy. And I personally can remember this, when my son was younger, going through the experience where I felt like I couldn't talk about or disclose, one, that I was a caregiver, and two, the diagnoses that were working diagnoses at the time, for fear of feeling isolated or judged, or in some aspects getting unsolicited advice when people don't understand what it means to be autistic or what severe ADHD might show up as. Doesn't mean I'm a bad parent and I don't need to discipline my child a different way, which is a common stereotype when you're going through that and you may not yet have the formal diagnosis, because there's a lot of misinformation or inaccurate information or just no information at all to people on how these things can and do show up in the caregiving journey, in the life journey, in our own journeys as we go through self-discovery.
And I might just pile on to something Connie said earlier around maybe hiring one or two autistic people to fill a very specific role and check a box. I honestly think it's very well intentioned, but often a pitfall that companies make is kind of falling into the trap of stereotypes and thinking, okay, we need a couple coders or technical roles, so let's hire a few autistic people. And these initiatives really need to start at the company level and changing culture. We can't just hire a few people and hope for the best. Because what happens is if maybe that isn't the right role or someone is looking to advance in their career, if the infrastructure is not there and the support's not there to allow someone to grow and thrive, these initiatives tend to wither on the vine. So I think it's really important that we kind of put those stereotypes aside and recognize that all different types of people and all different types of skills are, kind of represented within the neurodivergent community. And you're talking to a couple neurodivergent people here on this line who, I do get surprised looks sometimes when I do disclose. So I think it's really important to remember there's, even if you're looking to hire neurodivergent individuals, you have a lot of them already at your company. So making sure we're kind of thinking about changing our cultures to be inclusive for everybody.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'll just add to that quickly, that I was listening to a podcast and something I took away from it is that the teams that perform the best are ones that have the most psychological safety. And it resonated with me because I think back to, there's oftentimes, this might be a stereotype, it might be something to be proud of, but with autism, if the diagnosis is well supported and is psychologically safe, there is a long-term loyalty there. But really that's for anyone. But there is particular research around if there is a place to express an opinion, have a discourse, no matter kind of the social hierarchy, to feel comfortable to raise an opinion. That psychological safety is big for high performance.
And just adding on that, building on the psychological safety, and when we think about the strengths that neurodivergent people can bring to the table around creativity, innovation, analytical thinking, attention to detail. I mean, I wish I had more attention to detail myself. Their ability with some diagnoses to really be hyper-productive and focused in periods of time. We can use that in all different roles, right? And so taking them out of that bucket of one particular type of career, we value and we could really benefit from those types of strengths and skill sets in many different roles and many different organizations. And so as Connie mentioned in the beginning, just removing those stereotypes and looking at the broader picture of where those skill sets and strengths can be utilized.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, building that psychological safety is in, making sure that you're making an effort to engage everyone so that they can share their ideas, not being judgmental, and really kind of being open to listening and being constructive in feedback and encouraging. And what are some other things that others can think of? Appreciating people.
I think another one is how I like the modality of how ideas are expressed. So closed caption, like allowing a space for cameras to be off if there's potentially a sensory overwhelm. Is that really detrimental to the actual meeting? Like really, what are the team norms, and really processing, is it safe for a person to have a camera off? Do we have features to turn on transcription, recording, closed captioning? 60% of the general population prefers closed captions, neurodivergent or not. So they are a really useful tool, just broadening accessible tools for everyone in the workplace.
And I think we need to really think about our accommodations policies and removing barriers, because of the fact that not everyone has a diagnosis, and also not everyone is comfortable disclosing their condition in the workplace, making it easy for someone to obtain those technology tools and tips. We shouldn't have to ask for it. It should just be there and embedded,
Ingrained.
right?
Yep,
So that everyone can work in a way that works for them.
for sure.
Absolutely. All right, so I'm gonna launch the poll before we kind of move on to our next kind of questions here. All right, so everyone should be able to see that come up, and all of our listeners, if you can engage with the poll, that would be great. They'll be tallied and we can respond to them in a little bit. So we can lean into that, building that culture a little bit more. In the work we do, we all know that there's a need for community support and workplace support, and that some of the systems that we see are not fully addressing some of the important clinical and social learning and environmental needs. And there's a huge opportunity to support the neurodiverse community and getting people to the right solutions. So we wanted to spend a little bit more time on building that culture of care and some strategies that employers can take to help their workforce and their families thrive. So Sara, you could share what are some of the common challenges or needs that Family First is solving for caregivers with the neurodivergent loved one?
Sure. I think it's important to start out with, we are a comprehensive solution. So we have people reaching out to Family First for many different reasons in the caregiving realm. And of everyone who reaches out to us, around 30% are calling for some sort of support with a child in particular. And half of those families are calling for a possible diagnosis or symptoms related to a neurodiverse condition. When parents turn to us in these situations, we hear from them that it can be very overwhelming. They don't know where to turn to, and they're really unaware of what exists to help them in those moments. Never mind the stress, the ambiguity, the different thoughts of, what is going on here, multiple other challenges with other family members, family dynamics, work relationships, and so on. It's very common for families to share with us that their child was diagnosed by the school for ADHD, and now they need to start medication. There's a big difference between the school identifying that there may be a learning disability versus a doctor making a diagnosis. And I think Rebecca touched on this a little bit. They're both very important. They both serve a purpose, as people grow and age, become parents, have children, they're realizing they may be neurodivergent, that there is a concept of self-diagnosis in the adult population. We help parents understand and navigate within both those types of landscapes. Some parents are overwhelmed by the special education, or in some states, the gifted student processes. And it can be very time consuming, it can be daunting, and in a lot of cases, it can be intimidating. If you've ever gone to an IEP meeting or an IEP determination meeting, the amount of people sitting around the table is pretty intense. And if it's just one parent, because the other parent has to work, it can be intimidating, and a lot of information to take in, and a lot of laws and regulations to even understand or start to comprehend, which as a parent sitting in that position, you can't consume and know it all. On top of that, they're trying to figure out what their child is eligible for through insurance or government agencies, community agencies, what is available through the school system and those IEP processes, which can create a lot of stress. Our team prides itself and our program prides itself and our platform by lifting a lot of those burdens right off of the parents' plates. So that we can advocate on their behalf, we can coordinate on their behalf, and it really allows the parents to be in the moment with their child, really gain an understanding, receive the education and information they need to continue to be able to balance supporting their child, going through these processes, managing life and managing work. When I think about Family First sort of lifting a lot of this burden off of working caregivers and parents' plates, or even those that may be going through a diagnosis themselves, I often reflect on my own experience when I was a young parent and I started to first go through a lot of the journey that I had with my son. And I just often go to this place of, boy, I wish I had someone who could have did all of that for me. I mean, there was a time where over the span of a few weeks, I think I called hundreds of transportation programs because my son just needed to get from his special education program over to his therapeutic after school program because I was a working mom and I needed my job, I needed the income. Hundreds of hours, hundreds of phone calls, and to no avail. I couldn't find that resource of support and was spinning my wheels. And if I just knew what I knew now or had the support back then to know, I could have simply requested safe transportation through his IEP process and it would have been solved. It would have saved me lots of time, lots of stress, lots of phone calls. I don't know, back then, maybe I was paying for minutes. I'm aging myself. But I think you can kind of get an idea of what I'm getting at. When I think about that same time, what I was going through as what I now know was caregiving, not just being a great mom and doing what I'm supposed to do for my child, but there are a lot of caregiving aspects that I was handling for him. I had all these feelings like I need to file for FMLA. I'm spending a lot of time in the hallway on the phone or my office door is closed all the time. Started to have this sort of anxiety, like my colleagues are probably seeing this. People are starting to question what is going on. I felt like I was going to need a modified schedule to solve that problem. And how would anyone understand me needing to take a later lunch in the day and go off and come back for a certain amount of time? At that point, I was loyal to my job. I loved my job. I was successful at my job. I trusted my colleagues. I trusted my employer. It was the time the best job of my life. This is now the best job of my life. But if you get what I'm getting at, I didn't want to be judged. I didn't want to explain what I was going through back then. And this was about 10 plus years ago, and we've come a long way in this. But really was nervous around what people would think of me or question my commitment to my role. Or, as I said earlier, give me some parental advice on how to solve the problem. It's not a solvable problem. It requires acceptance, understanding, and support for parents taking care of loved ones, for those going through it themselves. And with that, I just always go back to the notion of, caregivers who are taking care of loved ones with a lot of complex needs or ambiguity. When you have someone facing a neurodivergent diagnosis throughout their childhood, it's not always easy to diagnose. You're really looking at the symptomology and how do you treat the symptoms as this child goes through hormonal changes, puberty, societal changes and pressures. Kids are faced with bullying nowadays. So it's not that easy to get a diagnosis. And so parents, people, caregivers, grandparents, friends alike, they're at higher risk for developing some mental health conditions like anxieties, insomnias, in some cases, depression. And that's where I share this. It's because that's one of my favorite parts of what we have the opportunity to do at Family First, is create an environment where people feel safe, they feel heard, they feel included, and then they can get the help and the support that they need, not only for their loved one going through this, but for themselves as well, so that they can get the mental health support they need if that's the case. Or maybe, as we've been talking about, they're going through this journey with their child or a loved one, and they're starting to realize, wow, maybe I see some of that symptomology in myself. What do I do now? Do I need to address this? What is the value of getting my own evaluations? Do I need a treatment plan through a doctor? Is this something I can manage on my own? And so we're there to support them through all those aspects.
Thanks, Sarah. I think that's really important to raising awareness about not making assumptions about people and the struggles that a lot of caregivers go through, you know, trying to balance a job that they love and the people that they love, and the need for support for individuals going through a lot of things in life. And Connie, what are some of the common ways that Joshin is supporting neurodivergent adults be going through something
Yeah,
similar?
I'll echo some of our commonalities between Family First and Joshin. There's so much of the information to support parents, and whether it's they're neurodivergent themselves or kiddos live in silos, or it's really hard to access information on just a Google. So having a wealth of navigation resources or subject matter experts, people who've gone through it, and leadership like you, Sarah, and our founders, it's just really wonderful. It's a vigor and a passion to get support to people quickly. So I'll say from the Joshin side of things, a navigation and care component where services are similar. We do also have that IEP process is really arduous, complex, frustrating, tense. There is a coaching component of our platform, so that's where a parent can meet in advance of, pre, during, post, all things IEP, to meet with that, whether it's a current special education teacher or someone who's really versed in the school system, to get that experience and quick advice to really reduce the hiccup time and the frustration, really just a sounding board for support as a parent on that piece. For adults, it's executive functioning coaching, accommodations coaching. So if you're exploring a diagnosis, about 15% of our members are unsure if they have a diagnosis. Also, about 16% of our members identify as autistic, about 8% with ADHD. And then a high prevalence, to your point, Sarah, about 7% with anxiety and 4% with depression. So there are oftentimes a really big overlap with mental health conditions with those neurodivergent conditions, and PTSD. So there's a prevalence of misdiagnosis, mistreatment, a prevalence of PTSD that can come from that experience. We do have folks who are on our platform with that. And we also have a series of tools for supporting the manager and then teams. So if you're someone who is just wanting to learn more about how to best support a neurodivergent employee, or you are a neurodivergent manager looking to support an employee, it's really this inclusive spot to really get support, not really gatekeeping any eligibility criteria on our end. Really, anyone is welcome to get the services free through your employer. And then, yeah, intersectional and dual diagnosis I mentioned, but really a lot of our coaching is also around financial independence. If you're in a position where you're wanting to live more independently, but are experiencing barriers to do that, we have coaches who are versed in that, workplace pieces, and then home management. So really all things like navigating a diagnosis. What are the conversations that need to happen with family, if there's any stigma, with loved ones, with friends. So really a series of coaches who really can provide that support.
That's really great, Connie. And Rebecca, is there anything that you would add that you've seen as far as effective approaches that have worked with that have worked really well with the employers that you work with?
Well, first of all, I'll say there is just such a huge interest right now from employers. And I think it's all the things we're talking about today. It touches so many people, whether as a parent, a caregiver, or having a loved one who's neurodivergent or neurodivergent themselves. I think this topic is really resonating with clients right now. But I also think there's a bit of a struggle of like, we know this is an issue, but how do we get started? Like, what do we do? Where do we start? And for companies that are just getting started, I think really focusing around the awareness and education across your entire population is a really great place to start. And that could be through, employee resource groups, either adding or enhancing if you have some of them already, just creating that place for dialogue and conversation about what is neurodivergence and what does it mean to different people, and training and unconscious bias training. I think we all carry biases, right? And so making sure if we're doing any kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion training that we're thinking about neurodiversity as just another dimension of diversity in all the things we do. And then maybe companies that have started to do some of those things, then we can really move into how do we identify the gaps in our well-being and health and engagement, and how do we solve it through some of the amazing work that Family First and Joshin are doing. I think, just kudos to the amazing work that both of your organizations are doing to create more neuro inclusion. So I think just kind of starting with, let's identify who in our population is neurodivergent, making sure we're giving people that space to, disclose and be comfortable disclosing. And then, how do we really address those gaps in mental health and well-being and engagement to make sure we're not just getting people in the door, but that we're really ensuring that neurodivergent people can thrive and we can deliver those amazing results that we know are possible when we have diverse populations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I feel a sense of urgency to say too, like there's oftentimes like a discourse around can these initiatives fall on employee resource groups? And I think there's so much free labor that falls on those employee resource group leaders doing this work on the side of their desk. And at some point that has tremendous impact on their performance at work, the well-being of that ERG, where we've seen tremendous results kind of speak on our side, where just there's really positive impact of outsourcing this support, whether it's like community groups that we house, the coaching support pieces, navigating resources, where sometimes there's the pressure to do that in ERG. There is not always the resources there forever to continue doing that. So it's been wonderful in our partnerships to outsource that support.
That's a
I
really
think that's
good.
a great call out, Connie, and making sure we're right, exactly, not just relying on employee resource groups, but using, I think there's a great opportunity for HR and benefits leaders to use employee resource groups as a source of feedback and making sure we're capturing the needs of our populations in our programming, and then also be a conduit for really disseminating messaging and making sure that employees are aware of the amazing benefits that we offer. So having some support structure and a feedback loop with ERGs is really important.
Yeah.
If I can just add on to that as well, from a clinical background and perspective, when we are forced to rely on our peers for support in situations, we truly I approach this, that there are a lot of dimensions to diversity. There are a lot of dimensions to caregiving. There are a lot of dimensions to the neurodivergent person understanding what their potential diagnosis is or their symptomology and treatment. And so when you can turn to expert professionals that can quickly get you to where you need to be, you alleviate a lot of that stress, which can produce anxiety, insomnia, and whatnot. And there is a ton of value for that individual, that employee, to go down a path that is right for them right from the beginning. There's just so much value there in so many different ways, physically, mentally, socioeconomically. Having that expert support is so crucial.
Yeah. Good points, everyone. We don't have any questions yet, so I'll remind everyone, if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A. And then before we wrap up, we wanted to take a look at the poll results. So we asked 2 poll questions. How supportive is your workplace of neurodiverse employees and families? And what actions are you currently taking to support neurodiverse employees and families within your populations and communities? And we got responses for the first one. The majority of respondents were seeing a very supportive workplace, 38%, and then are very supportive, then supportive, and then neutral, which I think is not surprising because there's been a lot of increasing awareness really over the last decade, and would expect that to continue to grow as we see continued efforts for workplace inclusiveness and more research coming out that inclusive workplaces are more likely to attract and retain really high performing employees and outperform their peers as far as organizational results. Any reactions anyone would add to that one? No. And then the second one is actions that organizations are taking to support neurodiverse employees and families. So 56% of the respondents said inclusion training, 39% caregiving benefits, 17% coaching, and then other, and these are all good strategies. And I think too, as we're maybe
I think this
something
aspect of coaching is a little newer. I think the idea that, you know, there's things that we need to cover through our medical plans and our health plans, but then there's things kind of that fall outside of that. That is, I think, a newer concept. And I love that we're exploring that, you know, with some of the solutions we're talking about today. But I think as a concept, not everything needs a medical diagnosis or medical treatment. Some things just need some coaching and support.
Absolutely. Yep. Any other considerations we'd give? I know there's a lot of employers bringing employees back to workplaces, and that could be a big change for some neurodivergent individuals and caregivers who have been working remotely to transition back. So I think it's a good time to consider environmental sensitivities, flexible schedules, opportunities for movement during the day, and kind of different opportunities for inclusive collaboration, like we talked about earlier, closed captioning and you know, agendas, and being able to share questions and feedback in different ways.
Yeah, I'll add to that point. There was, with COVID, like a really high success rate or increase in employment of neurodivergent folks, just given the ability to work remotely, control that environment. We are seeing a slight decrease with these mandates to return back to work. So I think just recognizing if you are an employer that is having these mandates around returning to work, just being conscientious of whether it's your job descriptions or the performance of that said job, if it really warrants that return to work, or acknowledging if there's potential opportunities for how that could be restricting inclusion of neurodivergent individuals. But all that being said, we are still seeing a really high success rate, just a slight decline right now. More broadly, it's about 4% of the US that's unemployed overall, but relative to 30 to 40% of the neurodivergent community that's unemployed. So there is a disparity there, but opportunities for us as various employers to troubleshoot that and solve that.
Very good.
I think it goes back to what we said too earlier about just recognizing different ways of working. And, you know, if you do need to have someone in an office, making sure there's quiet spaces or, you know, ways to kind of block out noise or visual stimuli, just kind of thinking about the fact that, you know, everyone works in different ways. And even if we need to be physically present at work, that we're still accommodating those things.
Absolutely.
And Rebecca, you said this earlier, but I think it's so important, and part of this response here to call out again is making those available for everyone. And making it easy to access those resources and supports, and not feel like a conversation has to be had about your sensitive information every time you may need what we call an accommodation. But simply, it's really just making your job easier to do with what you were hired to do. So just making it easy for everyone. And the more people adopt that and it's more accessible, the more others will follow.
Definitely. All right. Yeah. Still waiting a couple questions, just maybe before we get to that, because we have a couple minutes. I wanted to give everybody an opportunity to share what you hoped our listeners take away from today's session as a summary. Connie, do you want to go ahead?
Say that one more time. I was reading the questions.
Sure. A takeaway, what we hope our listeners take away from today's session. One takeaway.
Yeah, of course. I think like radical celebrating is to normalize. Like it is one day where it is just integration without discussion. Like it is seeing someone on a billboard who has a visible disability and just saying like that is the expectation, or we don't need to address that as taboo. So I think that is something to gear towards. There are various ways to celebrate, just really reflecting on where your current state is and opportunities to get to that point.
I love that. And Rebecca, what do you hope listeners are walking away with?
So maybe two thoughts. One, empathy, like just one word, empathy. I think if we can be more empathetic and kind of check our biases at the door, I think that will go a long way in just breaking a lot of the stigma and discrimination and stereotypes. And then maybe two, just reiterating that point about designing for neurodiversity is designing for everybody, just as we build a wheelchair ramp, maybe for someone with a physical disability, but everyone can benefit. You sometimes you have your roller suitcase, or you're pushing a baby in a stroller. The programs we put in place to support neurodiversity can really benefit everybody at different points in their life. So I guess those would be my two brief takeaways.
Yeah, so important to inclusive teams and workplaces. And Sara, what are your takeaways for listeners?
I think everything that Connie and Rebecca said, and then I'll add that statistics show that 70% of working employees are caregiving in some capacity or will at some point in their journey. And many of those working caregivers are supporting either themselves or their loved ones with many conditions, but inclusive of neurodiversity. And identifying caregivers or people with neurodiversity, especially with the acceptance of self-diagnosing or self-proclaiming your symptomology, especially in the adult population, which is being accepted by the medicine in general. It's not easy to always find them in the data, and we may not identify them in a report that we have in front of us, but it is important to know that they're there, know that they could be struggling, know that they may not be talking about it because they're not quite ready, but providing the different strategies that we've shared some today and some of those supportive programs that are going to allow them to have that long-term success. And that by accepting that there are many dimensions to diversity, that means you are understanding and you are supporting, and you are creating that awareness and acceptance across the employee's environment.
Yeah, very, very important. We did get one question. So the question came from the audience of, do any of your companies provide employees an opportunity to self-disclose their neurodiversity similar to their demographics, like gender and ethnicity? And I know that can be a challenge. Have any of you worked with groups where you've seen?
I will say I'm seeing more companies use self-ID campaigns and sort of making it a thing at the company that's also paired with that education and awareness that we're gathering this information so that we can program better for you. We're seeing a lot of success when it's kind of framed in that way. And it's always optional for someone to disclose, but if you create a safe, confidential way to do that and explain why, that's where we see I think companies be the most successful in gathering that data.
Great answer.
I'll echo that. Our process for gathering any sort of diagnosis data, we're always sharing the why, how it's used, or how it won't go back to their employer. So that's big for us as far as that reporting. And then any updates at any given time can occur, so after they sign up. So if that diagnosis information changes, if they've decided to go from I'm unsure of a diagnosis to exploring one and get a formal diagnosis or self-diagnose, they can have the ability to change that within their experience with us. And the pieces around gender and ethnicity, there is that intersectional support provided by our coaches. For example, there's a higher prevalence of trans folks who also identify as neurodivergent. We have coaches that identify with both of these identities to provide coaching support. And similarly, just women who identify as autistic who maybe present differently than men. So these spaces are there for the intersectional needs of individuals too.
Great.
And
And
similar-
go ahead,
sorry.
Sarah.
Similar to
Sorry.
what Connie was saying, I would say that our approach by design is to create an open, trusting, empathetic environment, and where our program is designed to not only solve the caregiving challenges, but we take care of the caregiver as well. It really creates this atmosphere where they do open up and they feel comfortable, and we actually encourage them to share what they have going on with themselves, regardless if there is a formal diagnosis or not, so that we can support any which part of that we can, so they can live a happy, healthy, balanced lifestyle on their caregiving journey, supporting their own neurodivergence or a loved one's.
Great. I know we're at time, so I wanted to thank Connie, Rebecca, and Sarah for joining me today. It was a great conversation, and I really appreciate all of your insights and stories that you shared. I've learned a lot. We'll close the session now. If any question was not answered, one of the speakers will follow up with you, and then within the next couple of days, everyone will receive a link to the replay and contact information if you'd like to reach any one of us. Thanks everyone for joining today. Bye.